So today we're going to talk about labeling your quilts, and it's such an important aspect. Just going back and even looking at old quilts that I've made and seeing some information about them is valuable to me. Sometimes I'll look at a quilt and I'll think, oh, I made that last year and it's been like 15 years since I made it. A good example of that is this one right behind me. I would have said I made that a few years ago, but as you can see from my label, it's been a lot longer than that. But before we get started talking about how I label my quilts, my name is Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you so much for joining me. Please consider subscribing and giving me that thumbs up and even hitting that bell for a notification of when I upload videos. So I pulled two quilts that I need to label, and I'm going to take you through my process step by step on how I label them. I know there's a lot of great videos and resources out there, and I just want to give you a peek into how I do it. There's so many different ways to do it. In fact, Brenda from Conquering Mount Scrapmore with Brenda, which is a great channel, by the way, you should check it out. She just did a whole video on labeling her quilts, and it has a lot of really great information in there. So I'm not going to repeat any of the information she has. I'm just going to show you how I do it. The two projects I picked to label are the table runner I made with Fallon from So Be It Quilts. If you remember, we did a tutorial on this, and we each made one with slight modifications to the fabric layout. I'll put a link here to that video so you can see that if you're interested. And I'm also going to label this little mini wall hanging that I made for Christmas. So let's get started seeing how I do it. So I make my quilt labels in Google Docs, and if you don't know how to get to that, if you go to your Gmail account, right up here there's this grid. And if you go down and click on Docs, that'll take you to this screen. And I have a quilt label document already, but if you don't have anything, you would just click on blank and create a document that way. It is free, and because you are on YouTube, you would have a Google account, a Gmail account. So if I go into quilt labels, the first thing I do is I pull in my margins because I want it to be small. I don't want it to be the size necessarily of the page. That is total preference on what you want to do. And I always start with the title and what I'm calling the project that I made, and then I put my name and where I live and when it is started and when it was finished, and then information about the project. Like if it were a baby gift, I'd put maybe the baby's name, the weight, the date of birth, all of that stuff, why I made it, that type of thing. Next, I will put the pattern, the fabric line I used, and if it's scraps, you just write scraps, and then the content of the fabric and batting. So if I used 100% cotton on top, I'd put that. If I used a batting that say was 80-20, I would put that there too. And then care instructions. And I think the care instructions is really important because a lot of times when we give quilts, especially as gifts, people think that they can't wash them, and that's just not true. So let's go down here. I have a few made. Get this centered. I pushed it down so I could do the example. All right, so for the table runner, this is the label that I'm making, and you can see I put the Glorious Gardens, that's the name I gave it. I just highlighted this and made it bold so it stood out. I can also change the font if I want to, but I do find that this is just a nice font that people will be able to read. I would normally put where I'm from here, but I'm not going to put that on here now because there's a lot of wackadoodles out there, so I don't want to give the town I live in. I also leave space so I can sign it because I think it is important to have our signature or handwriting on the backs of these quilts. And then I put when I started and finished it, the information about it, the pattern, where that pattern's from, the fabric line, and then all of the information here about the quilt. And if you see down here, I made a smaller label. This is for the mini wall hanging that I have. I'm calling this Wishing You a Mini Little Christmas, and just some information about it. So after I get this all finished and edited, I will send it to the printer and print it on to this fabric paper. Now I've tried to do the fabric paper that you make yourself with freezer paper and muslin, and I just can't seem to get it right. It always jams my printer. So I just buy this. It is a little pricey, and that's why I like to do several of the labels together on one sheet so I don't waste so much of it. So let's print this and I'll show you what I do next. Okay, so here it is. This is the labels that I just printed. So I'm going to trim these down, cut them out, and I will just quickly do that to show you. And I leave the backing on while I do this. And I also want to make sure I leave at least a 1/4 inch on the borders around the writing, because I'm going to be putting on some fabric and I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So cut this out. And you can see that this writing is a little closer on this side than it is on this side. So I'm just going to see how the difference is. It's like just a little less than a 3/4 of an inch. And I'm just going to line that up, make sure it's straight. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to take a little bit off the top. Make sure that's straight-ish. I'm going to take a little more off, I think. Yeah. There. All right, so that's my label. And I'm going to now peel off the backing. And I leave the backing on to cut it out because it stabilizes it. I just pull that off and it's just a stiff piece of muslin. And you can just discard this. Okay, so your next step is up to you. You could fold under a 1/4 inch all the way around and just applique this onto the back of your quilt or of your table runner or whatever it may be. But what I like to do is add some fabric, and I usually try to keep some scraps from the project and I'll add them around the outside. And I just pick some that are going to kind of go, and I'll sew these on, and then I'll meet you back here. All right, so you can see I just did a very simple border around it. I trimmed it down a little bit. And the next step is really up to you. Again, you could turn this under, get that piece of scrap, and just press it and make a square that you could applique down. But the goal is to get something that you can put down and hand stitch, or at least that's what I do, hand stitch it onto the back. What I like to do is take a fusible interfacing, and this is a super lightweight one. I think it's used for sewing clothing, and I do this with a lot of my applique pieces. It's a little bit of a cheater's way to do it, but it works. So I'll take it and put the fusible side up, so the little bumps up, and then right sides together on my label, okay? And I'm gonna sew all the way around the perimeter with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll show you what I do next. Okay, so I sewed all around the perimeter. I didn't leave an opening for turning because I'll show you what we're gonna do. So I am gonna trim away all of the edges here, just the excess. You don't have to be really particular about it. It's super thin, so it's gonna lay flat regardless. That's good enough. Okay, and then I pull this apart like this, okay, and just take a pair of scissors and snip only in the backing, only in that interfacing, and that's how I'm going to turn it. It tears a little bit. That's not a big deal because really you're just wanting to get those edges under. Turn it around, push out your points. And now you have a way to iron this on, hold it into place while you hand stitch it down. Put this right onto the quilt backing. I'll show you right here. Let's see, where do I want it? Yeah, I'll put it right here. Let me grab a hot iron and show you how this works. All right, I'm gonna try not to hit my masking tape. You're just gonna press this down all the way around really well, and you can see it holds it into place so it's easier to hand stitch. And it pulls all those ends under too, which is awesome. It's like a cheater way to applique. Okay, it's holding it on there pretty good. It's not super strong of an adhesive, but it's enough that will allow you to get these stitched down. So you can see it's pretty on there. And all you're gonna do then is go around this edge. You can either quilt it right through if you don't mind it coming through on the front of your quilt, or just hand stitch it down with a whip stitch like you would on a binding, like when you're finishing a binding, just whip stitch it down. My advice to you on that is to match the background, not this. So I'm going to use a black thread and just stitch it down all the way around. And that's how I do a label. So I've used this method probably for the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, and I really like it. Now I have used the pre-printed labels before on some of my quilts. I've handwritten the whole label. I've even printed the whole label onto the back and incorporated it into the backing of the little mini quilt like I did on this quilt. This was an ugly quilt challenge at a guild I belonged to a few years ago, and it really is kind of neat because it is into the actual quilt. It's not the prettiest quilt in the world, but it wasn't meant to be. It's supposed to be ugly. So it definitely did the trick, and it allowed me to practice even my machine quilting over that real thick fabric. So I hope this helped you. Just know there are so many different ways to label a quilt. The important part is that you get some identification onto it. Trust me, you will enjoy going back and looking at the year that you made a certain quilt or that you did a certain project. It's a lot of fun, and the years just seem to fly by. Have a great day. I hope you take some time to sew, and I will see you soon. Bye.